Hello, Dr. Laura. Thank you so much for joining the Internal Communication Spotlight series that I run on my blog and my YouTube channel. So I'm very delighted to have you on my show. I know that you are an expert in neuroscience, in communications especially, and you've authored a couple of books, and very delighted to know that you can share some thoughts in this area. So before we get started, it'll be great if you could quickly introduce yourself for our viewers.
Terrific. Thank you so much for having me on your show. And my name is Dr. Laura McHale. I'm American, actually, but I live in Hong Kong. I am a leadership psychologist, and I work with organizations on a wide variety of issues. I consult with them on leadership development, team, culture building, etc. I am the author of a new book called Neuroscience for Organizational Communication, a guide for communicators and leaders. The publisher is Palgrave Macmillan, and it was just published in January.
Fantastic. And I know you're going to be an IABC speaker as well, so all the best for that.
Absolutely, absolutely. The IABC has been great to me because years ago I did my the old kind of the precursor of their new certified communication professional program, but I did a program called the ABC, the Accredited Business Communicator, and I've had the chance to speak at a couple of their world conferences now, which is really exciting.
Great. So let's get started. I just wanted to ask you what got you excited, what got you to explore and go deeper into this area of neuroscience in communications especially?
I really started when I was doing my doctorate. So I had a long career doing corporate communications. I spent about 15 years working primarily for big investment banks and financial services organizations. I decided to go back to school to get a doctorate in leadership psychology. And while I was in that program, I took a neuroscience class, and I was hooked from the first class. I ended up doing a program where you could specialize in the neuroscience of leadership as part of the program, and I jumped at the chance and didn't know it, but I was a neuroscience person all along.
Great. And so can you explain to me, I know you, like you mentioned, you've been in communications before you got into the consulting side of things. So why is it that few communicators really consider this aspect of communicating better?
I think that there's a few things going on. I think communicators are actually very interested in psychology. A lot of them are really, I joke that a lot of them are kind of closeted organizational psychologists. They just don't really know it. If you think about how communicators are interested in understanding people's behavior, both with internal and external audiences, and trying to use communication in order to influence behavior, that really makes communication sit amongst behavioral science more generally. The neuroscience piece is a little, I think there really aren't very many guides for communicators in that space. One of the reasons that I wrote my book is I noticed there was a gap in the academic literature in terms of applications of neuroscience specifically to communication. There's a lot that's been done on neuroscience and kind of the concept of communication more generally as in human communication, but specifically looking at what's going on in organizations. It's really a brand new field, and I think people are starting to get increasingly interested in it. Hopefully my book will be helpful as a guide and kind of lighting the way.
Fantastic. So if you could explain, where can communicators, and especially internal communicators, like you mentioned, they are closer to a lot of, people engagement issues and stuff like that. So where can they really begin with if they want to think of neuroscience in communications?
There's a lot of things that they can do. I think starting to become familiar with organizational psychology more generally is a really good first step. Neuroscience itself is actually such an enormously complex field, and there's also a lot of neuromania and quackery out there. So I see, especially in living in Hong Kong, I see a lot of organizational consultants that sort of style themselves as neuropsychologists, et cetera, without having any actual neuroscience training. And I sometimes hear various consultants, even though they're so well intended and they're trying to, increase interest in the brain, speak in a lot of generalizations that actually belies the complexity of what's going on with the brain. So one of the things that I really counsel people is to be very discerning consumers of neuroscience, researchers and neuroscience information. I think my book hopefully is a good place to start, but I'm hoping that the book is just the beginning, and the field actually gets more people get drawn to it, and we get more research coming out of it that is of high quality and hopefully peer reviewed.
Right. And since you played, both roles, you've been a communicator and now you are a consultant. So, how different are these two roles when it comes to neuroscience? And I know you mentioned also you're trying to bridge the gap between theory and practice. So, where does it all fall in place?
I think, there's a few things that are similar. I used to, when I did comms, I primarily focused on internal and executive comms. So I did a lot of executive speech writing and things like that. And I still do largely work with leaders and leadership teams in my work now. I think though, when I did comms, I was a bit more tactical, a bit more hands-on. Now I'm a little bit more big picture strategic. I think about what's happening in the brain when I'm drafting messages and when I'm working with communicators on the messages that they're drafting, of what sorts of things are likely to be going on in people's brains. And I'm much more better informed, I think, on some of the cultural differences in people from different cultural backgrounds oftentimes have different biological reactions to the way certain communications are presented. A great example of that is what the topic of what I'm speaking to the IABC about at the World Conference this month actually is pronoun use, the use of I and we pronouns. It turns out they actually impact people from different cultural backgrounds in different ways. So I think I'm a little bit more knowledgeable about that now.
Great, great. And there are two aspects, change and crisis communications, which most of the communicators often face at the workplace. And now there are organizations also which have nudge units, and they use a lot of influence in communication. So, what's your sense of how neuroscience can act on these areas, and how can it help communicators better?
Oh, there is so much on this, and I think so much that we're learning that neuroscience is helping us understand about change and also crisis, and also the role of loss and grieving and trauma in organizations. In the last chapter of my book, I talk about the neuroscience of compassion and a concept known as post-traumatic organizational growth, which is how organizations that have gone through trying and traumatic times actually proceed to grow and have healthy places to work. There's, from a communications perspective, I think a lot can be done in terms of self-care. Communicators are subject to the same sorts of vicarious traumatization that psychologists are, and other people who work with traumatized individuals. And so self-care for communicators is really important, but also, and more generally, just allowing people to have rich emotional lives at work, and using organizational communication as an outlet, as a conduit for making that happen.
Fantastic. And if you had one piece of advice for communicators in terms of how they can adopt neuroscience in everyday work, is there anything that you can share?
I'd say absolutely, if they are interested in neuroscience and communication, to check out my book. It is an academic book. It is pretty nerdy, but I did write it to be accessible for everyday communications practitioners. That really was my primary audience. I'm also going to be launching in just a few weeks a new online program of on-demand videos called Neuro for Comms, which is neuroscience training for communicators.
Fantastic, fantastic. This has been great talking to you, and all the best again for your IBC presentation, and of course, authoring many more books in this area.
So I hope so. Thank you so much for the opportunity.